Hey friends, welcome to another video. Today I've got a pretty cool gun. This is the Keltec PMR30. This is not a new gun. This just happens to be a new review of mine. I got one of these things probably about 9 years ago. I think they've been out for about 10 years. And the weird thing is, when I got this, I was kind of in a phase. You know how we go through these phases? And I was doing a lot of work on 1911s. I'm a big 1911 guy. Really respect the work that John Browning did over the years. And of course, I really got into it and I was modifying a bunch of my 1911s. And I just happened to come across this thing, never fired it. So I sold it to a friend because I never fired it at all back when it had first come out. Here recently, I kind of got the itch again. You know, it's a neat little round, the 22 Magnum. But I was like, you know what? I want to get one of those things. I want to run it. I've still never shot one, even back when I had one. And since then, I've never put my hands on one and actually put a round through it. So I wanted to do it again. So I purchased this one at Gator Guns in Sulphur, Louisiana. I did purchase this one with my own money. Gator Guns is really good to me and they support the show and they do give me good prices on my firearms, but I do purchase my firearms from there. So this is not a paid review. So I want to talk a little bit about this. The PMR30 is a cool gun. It's not going to be one that you're going to carry. At least I'm not going to carry this. 22 Magnum is not the round that I intend to carry. Also, always like to say that you're responsible for every single round that leaves the muzzle. And if you get into some kind of a firefight with an attacker or something like that, and my whole thing is if you're shooting a 22 Magnum, just the type of projectile that you're shooting is typically going to have the power to go through your attacker depending on where you hit them. And you are responsible for all 30 rounds because this thing does hold 30 rounds in the magazine. 22 Magnum is not known as a self-defense round. I see this as a fun round to shoot. It's a very fast round to shoot. Again, it's the same projectile as a 22 long rifle. It's just that it's got a lot more power behind it, Magnum. So it's fun, very straight, flat shooting round. The pistol itself, kind of like Keltec. Keltec's known for doing things that are slightly outside the box. It does have the familiar look of all Keltecs with the, I guess if you want to call that stippling, but the cuts on the actual frame. This particular gun only weighs probably 12, 13 ounces, something like that. It's got, if you'll notice the black portion in the front, that's the actual slide according to the instruction manual of the PMR30. And this is a slide cover on the back. The front portion of the slide is actually steel. The rear portion, that is the cover, is polymer, as is pretty much the rest of the gun is polymer as well. If you look at it, it looks like this thing would be back heavy because you have so much stuff back here and so little up front. But if you actually hold the thing and balance it, it leans forward pretty fast because it has most of its weight being the metal portion of it is going to make this thing lean forward. That's a good thing. While we don't have much muzzle rise with a 22 long rifle, a 22 Magnum, we do have some, very, very little. So what you're gonna have is you're gonna have that little bit of additional weight that you have out front is gonna offset that want to rise a little bit. So you're gonna be able to tame that a little bit. I like that. Now, speaking of shooting this thing, I love the sights on this. I have not fired this yet, but just looking at them and dry firing it, I absolutely love them. You'll notice the very long fiber optic sights. Long because they're grabbing a bunch of light. The whole intent of fiber optic sights is that they're quickly accessible and that they're very, very bright, that they stick out, that your eyes are drawn to them naturally. You're going to get that with that longer fiber. That longer fiber is pulling in so much more light that whenever you look at them from the rear of the gun, you can't help but notice them. I also like the fact that they're different colors. I like the front one being green and the rear ones being orange. Again, that's going to allow you, if you're using this gun as a training aid, to train yourself to focus on that front sight. You should be able to see the rear sights as you're looking at the front sight because obviously you can notice more things in your peripheral vision while you're looking. But you shouldn't be focusing on those rear sights. That front green sight is what I'm going to train my eyes to always go to that front sight. And again, I see my target past that sight, but I'm not looking at that target. The whole purpose of that is to make sure that, again, if you are responsible for every single round, you also have a little bit more control of where that round is going when you're focusing on your front sight, because inherently that's where that round is going to follow if you have this thing planed out and aimed properly. The trigger for a gun at this price, this is a remarkable trigger. I know you've probably heard other people talk about the trigger, but I gotta tell you, I have measured this thing time and time again, and it comes in sub 3 pounds or right at the 3 pound mark. For a gun like this, that's pretty impressive. Now, the beauty of that is if that's a scary thing for you, especially if you're teaching kids or youngsters or anyone else that's new to firearms how to shoot using the PMR30, you do have the luxury of having ambidextrous safety, manual safety on both sides. So you're gonna have that if you have that fear. And to me, if you're using it as a training aid, obviously that's what you want to do. You want to load this thing up, put it on safety, and teach your young people or whoever your beginner shooters are that this is a safe way to manage this thing, because you don't want them being intimidated by firearms by hitting somewhat of a hair trigger. Look, a 3-pound trigger, there are people who modify their 1911s to have 3-pound triggers. That's not exactly a hair trigger. That's a very sensitive trigger. So you don't want this thing going off before somebody has a chance to be ready for that recoil, even though it's a manageable amount of recoil on the PMR30 with this 22 mag. It does come with 2 30-round magazines. These magazines are polymer. They seem to hold up okay. I was loading them earlier just to see how they load, and they load relatively easy. They're not the hardest thing in the world to load. If you do get a staggered round in there, which you're prone to and you very well could, the next round typically will seat it properly, because the way you put these things in there, when you put it down, the rim is going to usually grab that previous round and shove it into place where it probably goes. So if you're getting these things staggered, if you notice that you put one in staggered, yeah, you do need to beat this thing on the back of it, and I hit them on the bottom also to let that spring work it a little bit. But don't go crazy unless you see a whole bunch of them going in back to back staggered. If you have one that goes in there staggered, the next one will probably seat it properly. So you're probably not gonna have a whole lot of trouble there. Okay guys, the first round is gonna shoot are the CCI Maxi Mag. These guys right here are actually recommended via the owner's manual. And the reason why I looked at that is I'm a typical guy, is I rarely look at instruction manuals. However, whenever I did my more recent review on the Glock 44 and 22 long rifle, I did look at the instruction manual, and it specifically stated what types of rounds that it preferred. So I did the same here, and oddly enough, they recommended the actual brand, this exact round. So I made sure and got some of these. I also got some Hornady 22 mag 30 grain VMAXs. These have a bit of a ballistic tip, and I think it's worth pointing out, if you notice that ballistic tip on there, I've got the 2 rounds here. The one on top is the one that PMR or Keltec recommends. I guess that makes it on top. But that's the 2 rounds there. The ones that you see with the ballistic tip is the Hornady, and the other one is the one they recommend, the CCI. I'm wondering if that's not going to be potentially a feeding issue. The feed ramp on this particular model is a very flat feed ramp. Sometimes the feed ramp, the change in the feed ramp can lend itself to difficulty loading that next round, mainly because it's more squared off. Where your rounded projectile typically can slide up that feed ramp a lot easier than one that's squared off, that can have a tendency to run into that flat ramp and bottom out and stop and not feed up the rest of the way into the chamber. So that's my only curiosity right now. As you go smaller and smaller and smaller, things get a little bit more tricky whenever you're trying to load up these feed ramps. Okay guys, I'm gonna go with the CCI first. All right, now let's run the Hornady. Well guys, that's gonna do it for me today. Ran a lot of rounds through this thing. I got to tell you, it's fun to shoot. The PMR30 is one of those kinds of guns that I could see being a pretty good training aid. If you're trying to introduce a youngster or a new person to the shooting sports, this would probably be something that's a little bit more realistic than, let's say, a 22 long rifle. And the reason why I say that is you do have a louder report. If you are trying to acclimate somebody to be a little bit closer to the type of things that they're going to encounter with a 9mm or a normal self-defense round, this might be a little bit more of a realistic feel without giving them that haunting intimidation factor of really too loud of a report. Like, you're getting a little bit more of a report than a 22 long rifle, of course, but not quite so loud as a 9 or one of the other, again, self-defense rounds. But what I like about it is you're getting a little bit more of that simulated felt recoil than you would in just a 22 long rifle. And I think that's important because you do not want to have someone that's going to find themselves either in a situation where they wind up going back to the range maybe by themselves, or they get in a self-defense situation where they have to actually utilize their carrier weapon and they're really taken aback or surprised, or more than normally surprised, by having a crazy amount of felt recoil that they weren't expecting. In other words, if you have a 22 long rifle, you might be really tricking them and fooling them into thinking that, hey, they're all about like this. To me, this gets you a little bit closer. I do feel like that's a little bit more of a benefit of using something like this. I also like the fact that it's a full-size frame. To me, that's going to lend itself to allowing the newer shooter to get more hand onto the actual pistol itself, meaning control. So again, you're going to take that learning curve, and I feel like get there, shorten that learning curve up a little bit and get to the point where that person is more in line with where you want them to be from a training standpoint in a little bit quicker fashion than using just simply a 22 long rifle. I like a lot about this thing. The trigger, you got to watch that trigger. That's another thing that you kind of got to be careful for if you're using this as a training aid, is that the trigger is so sensitive, being around that 3 pound mark, that you have to make sure that you don't, your shooter has to be ready. Make sure your shooter is ready whenever they're going to engage it. I mean, obviously, we should be in the practice of teaching all the rules of gun safety anyway. That should be something that we never shy away from. So if we're teaching those properly and your shooter has their muzzle pointed in a safe direction all the time and their finger stays off the trigger until they're actually ready to shoot, then having that somewhat of a hair trigger at 3 pounds is not going to be a huge detriment. But you got to make sure that you're pushing those rules of gun safety, because if you leave those out and you simply throw this in somebody's hand and they're muzzling people as they're walking to the firing line, very good chance that if that trigger finger is anywhere near that trigger, they could set this thing off. Impressive trigger nonetheless for a lower price gun, that's for sure. I did find that the 22 mag by the Hornady 30 grain VMAX ran pretty much and fed pretty much just as good as the CCI Maxi Mag that Keltec actually recommends. The one thing I did notice as the day went on is as this thing got dirty, 22 mag has a tendency to, I don't want to say foul up the gun quite a bit, but I've got unspent gunpowder, I don't want to say all over my hand, but on the top portion of my hand where that muzzle would fly up, and that unspent powder is coming out of the ejection port and it's getting on my shooting hand. It's like on the back side over here, you can see I've got some unspent powder. There's probably some on my arms and on top of my head or whatever. I feel like that's one thing that we kind of got to be careful for, because this thing started to jam up on me a little bit towards the end of the day. Granted, I put, let's see, we've got 50-50, about 550 rounds through this thing today. And that's a lot of rounds for rounds that tend to leave behind a little bit of spent gunpowder. So it's one thing you got to kind of watch out for. If you're out there working this thing, it's super easy to tear this thing down. You simply push a pin out on the side over here. That's your control pin. Push it out, pull it out, and the whole slide slides forward. Just a point, you do not shoot the trigger like you have to fire your trigger in order to take the slide off. You do not do that with this PMR30. You leave this thing in the cock position. Obviously, check your chamber to make sure that you're empty. And you simply pull this pin out and the whole slide slides forward. If not, what you have to do is, if you've already released the trigger and sent it forward, when you pull that pin out, you're gonna have to go ahead and just rack that thing anyway. Without the pin in there, it'll still rack the slide, but you'll have to rack that and then you'll have to slide your slide forward. It won't do that if you have disengaged the trigger at that point. But you'll want to clean this thing out. I mean, if it were me and you're taking it to the range and you're wanting to have a little bit of fun, because these rounds are cheaper than most of your normal self-defense and larger calibers, not quite as cheap as a 22, of course, but they are a cheap round nonetheless. You may find yourself bring a can of rim oil or some gun scrubber with some additional oil along the way, because this thing is going to start to get gummed up a little bit. I noticed even as small as it is, the chamber mouth as it goes into the chamber seemed to get pretty dirty as the day went on today. So just some things to point out, guys. Fun gun to shoot nonetheless. I had a good time shooting it. I think that you would do yourself good to get one. I do feel like they're a good training aid. I do feel like they're fun to shoot. And, you know, compared to some of the guns that are out on the market now, some of the newer guns, I hate to keep beating Glock up, But there are some guns out there that were supposed to be somewhat training aids and supposed to be good guns out there, and these were the next big thing all of a sudden, that you were gonna have your cheaper alternative to training, and they don't seem like they've been quite so reliable, where this one on the other hand does seem like it is. But look guys, it's like any other gun. You cannot run any gun. I don't care what anybody says, and I don't care what gun they have. You cannot run any gun indefinitely without cleaning it and without lubricating it. You have to clean your weapons at some point. Anyone that makes the claim that you don't have to clean any guns, and I know everybody's going to give me their claims of I've shot this gun 10,000 rounds and I've never cleaned it. That's awesome. But it may take 12,000. At some point you will have to clean your weapon. And it's just irresponsible to not do that anyway. I mean, seriously, this is a machine. You take care of your machines. You don't just drive your vehicle until the motor burns up to be spiteful enough to say, well, I ran it, 400,000 miles and it never, it didn't stop going until it was 400,000 miles. You know what? Maybe you get 500,000 miles out of it. You change the freaking oil in it. Same goes for this. Maintain your pieces, guys. Look, folks, don't ever be afraid to be the safest person in the room and the deadliest.